The Douglas C-47 Skytrain groaned as it banked over the endless snow-dusted forests of central Russia. Inside the vibrating fuselage, Captain Frank Mac McAllister adjusted his leather flight jacket. He was a Texan with 5 years of engineering experience at Bell Aircraft and 1,000 hours in the cockpit. Beside him sat Lieutenant Billy Miller, a kid from Ohio who looked too young to shave but could make a P-39 dance in the air. They were part of a specialized American liaison group sent to the 22nd Reserve Air Regiment in Ivanovo. Their mission? Teach the Red Air Force how to fly the most unorthodox fighter in the American arsenal, the P-39 Airacobra. "Mac, look at the airfield," Billy said, pressing his face to the cold plexiglass window. "It looks like a damn cow pasture." Mac looked down. Ivanovo wasn't the paved, organized base they were used to in Buffalo or North Africa. It was a strip of packed earth and ice, surrounded by dark pines and weathered wooden hangars. As the C-47 touched down, the landing gear rattled so violently, Mac thought the rivets would pop. Chapter 2. The Reception. When the door opened, the Russian winter hit them like a physical blow. The air didn't just feel cold, it felt sharp, like it was trying to cut the oxygen out of their lungs. Waiting for them on the tarmac was a group of men who looked less like pilots and more like survivors of a shipwreck. They wore heavy, grease-stained sheepskin coats, bekeshas, and fur hats with the ear flaps down. A tall officer with a jagged scar across his cheek stepped forward. He didn't salute with the polished precision of a West Point grad. He gave a curt, professional nod. "Major Nikolai Volkov," he said in heavily accented English. "Welcome to Ivanovo. You have the Cobras?" "They're coming in by rail and ferry through Iran, Major," Mac replied, shaking a hand that felt like a piece of frozen hickory. "We're here to make sure your boys don't kill themselves in them. The Cobra is temperamental." Volkov's eyes flickered with a dry, mirthless humor. "Temperamental, yes. We understand this word well in Russia." Chapter 3. The Shock. As they walked toward the command dugout, Mac stopped dead in his tracks. Behind a line of camouflage netting sat a row of aircraft that looked like relics from a bygone era. They were small, stubby, almost comical. They were constructed mostly of wood and stretched fabric. The engines were exposed, and the landing gear looked like something off a bicycle. "What are those?" Billy asked, his voice dropping in disbelief. "Polikarpov I-16, Volkov said casually. "The pilots call it Ishak, the little donkey." Mac walked over to one. He ran his hand along the wing. It wasn't duraluminum. It was plywood covered in lacquered fabric. The cockpit was open to the elements. No heater, no radio. The gun sight was a primitive ring and bead. "You're kidding me," Billy muttered. "Major, you're taking these up against Messerschmitt Bf-109s? Metal planes? Fuel-injected engines?" Volkov stopped and looked at the little donkey. "Last week, Lieutenant Sokolov over there used that wood to ram a Junkers bomber because his guns jammed. He bailed out and walked back to base. The wood is flexible. The wood is quiet." Mac looked at the I-16, then back at his own polished boots. He had come here thinking he was the high-tech savior bringing real planes to the primitive East. But looking at the scorched engine cowlings and the grim faces of the Russian pilots, he realized he wasn't looking at outdated pilots. He was looking at men who had been fighting a war of annihilation with nothing but splinters and courage. "Major," Mac said softly, "the P-39 has the engine behind the pilot. It has a 37mm cannon that will kick like a mule. If you stall it, it enters a flat spin that is nearly impossible to break. It's a Ferrari. It's delicate." Volkov lit a thick, pungent cigarette, a paparosa. "Captain, my men have been flying kites with engines attached to them. They do not need a Ferrari. They need a hammer. We will see if your Cobra can be a hammer." The following morning, the sun rose as a pale, heatless disk over the Russian horizon. Mac and Billy headed to Hangar 4, where the first crate-delivered P-39s were being reassembled. The Americans were used to the sterile, organized environments of buffalo plants, where every tool had a shadow board and every mechanic wore clean coveralls. Ivanovo was different. The hangar smelled of old kerosene, unwashed wool, and a sharp, acidic glue used for repairing wooden wings. "Look at them, Mac," Billy whispered. A group of Soviet mechanics, several of them women with grease-blackened fingernails, were manhandling a heavy Allison V1710 engine. They weren't using a hydraulic hoist. They were using a series of rusted chains and sheer muscle. One woman, her head wrapped in a floral scarf under a heavy cap, was tapping a fuel line with a wrench, listening to the resonance. "They treat these machines like livestock," Billy remarked, watching a Russian mechanic kick a stubborn landing gear door into place. "No," Mac corrected, watching the woman with the scarf. "They treat them like weapons. There's a difference." Major Volkov appeared out of the gloom, followed by a young pilot who looked barely 18. "Captain McAllister, this is Senior Lieutenant Andrei Sokolov. He is our ace. 8 kills on the I-16. He will be the first to transition to the Airacobra." Mac shook Sokolov's hand. The kid's palm was a map of scar tissue. Burns from a cockpit fire, most likely. "Andrei wants to know," Volkov translated, "why the Americans put the engine behind the man. Is it because the Americans are afraid of the wind, or because they do not trust the pilot to see over the nose?" Mac smiled. "Tell him it's for the gun. By putting the engine in the middle, we could fit a 37mm M4 cannon right in the nose. It fires through the propeller hub. It's like flying a sniper rifle." Sokolov's eyes lit up at the word cannon. He walked around the sleek, tricycle-geared P-39. Compared to the stubby, barrel-like I-16s outside, the Cobra looked like a silver needle. "It is beautiful," Sokolov said in broken English. "But where is armor? Where is protection for the cooling system?" Mac hesitated. "The radiator is in the belly. The coolant lines run along the floor." Sokolov exchanged a grim look with Volkov. They knew something the Americans hadn't fully processed yet. In the low-level dogfights over the Eastern Front, the belly of a plane was the most vulnerable place. One lucky shot from a German infantryman with a Mauser could bleed the Cobra dry of its lifeblood. Chapter 5. The Pre-Flight Ritual. The time came for the first demonstration flight. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Billy was shivering even in his heavy flight suit, but the Russians seemed unfazed. "Mac, we have a problem," Billy said, pointing at the P-39's wings. "The oil is thickening. The starters won't catch. This American grease is turning into wax in this cold." The Soviet mechanics laughed when they saw the Americans struggling with the blowtorches. One mechanic, a giant of a man named Boris, walked over with a bucket of what smelled like raw gasoline mixed with light oil. Before Mac could stop him, Boris began pouring a small amount of gasoline directly into the oil sumps of the brand-new American engines. "Hey! Stop!" Billy shouted. "You'll blow the seals! That's a precision-engineered Allison engine, not a tractor!" Volkov stepped in, hand on Billy's shoulder. "Lieutenant, if we do not thin the oil, the engine will seize before the first turn of the prop. In Russia, the engine must learn to drink gasoline, or it dies in its sleep." Mac watched in horrified fascination as the Russians lit small fires in pans underneath the engines to warm the blocks. It was a primitive, dangerous ritual that would have gotten a crew chief court-martialed back in the States. But 10 minutes later, when Sokolov climbed into the car door cockpit of the P-39 and hit the starter, the engine didn't just groan, it roared to life with a ferocious, hungry snarl. Chapter 6. The Flat Spin. Sokolov took off. The tricycle gear, a rarity for Soviet pilots used to tail draggers, made the takeoff run look strange. The plane stayed level instead of lifting its tail. Once in the air, the P-39 showed its grace. Sokolov pushed it hard, performing loops and tight turns that made the American engineers hold their breath. "He's pushing the center of gravity," Mac muttered. "He needs to be careful. If he gets that nose too high in a bank..." As if on cue, The P-39 at the apex of a vertical climb suddenly shuddered. Because the engine was behind the pilot, the P-39 had a unique and deadly trait. If it stalled, the heavy rear end wanted to lead. The plane whipped around. In a second, it wasn't flying, it was tumbling like a falling leaf. A flat spin. "Bail out!" Billy yelled, though Sokolov couldn't hear him. "Get out of there!" On the ground, the Soviet pilots watched in total silence. They didn't scream, they didn't panic. They simply watched the silver needle rotate toward the frozen earth. Inside the cockpit, Sokolov was experiencing a nightmare. The centrifugal force was pinning him against the side of the door. He couldn't reach the stick properly. The world was a blur of white snow and gray sky. Mac felt a knot in his stomach. He had seen this in testing. The P-39 was a killer in a spin. Suddenly, the engine roared, a desperate, surging burst of power. Sokolov wasn't trying to pull up. He was using the torque of the engine and the rudder to force the nose down, fighting the very physics of the aircraft. At the last possible second, the spinning stopped. The nose dropped, the wings caught the air, and the P-39 leveled out barely 50 feet above the pine trees. The plane taxied back to the line. When Sokolov climbed out, his face was white, and he was drenched in sweat despite the freezing air. He walked up to Mac, panting. He pointed a trembling finger at the P-39. "This," Sokolov said, "is not a plane. This is a Cobra. It waits for you to sleep, then it bites." Volkov nodded, looking at Mac. "You see, Captain, your plane is very advanced, very fast, but it has no soul. It tries to kill its friend." Mac looked at the P-39, then at the row of wooden I-16s. He realized that the Americans had designed a machine for ideal conditions. The Russians were living in a world where nothing was ideal. "We need to adjust the ballast," Mac said, his voice grim. "And we need to teach your boys how to fight the spin. Because if the Germans see you tumbling like that, they'll finish what the plane started." "No," Volkov said, looking at the horizon where the sound of distant artillery rumbled like thunder. "The Germans are already coming. We don't have time for more lessons. Tomorrow, we go to the front." The order to relocate came at midnight. The German advance was a jagged line on the map that moved like a slow-motion flood. The 22nd Reserve Air Regiment was no longer in reserve. They were being hurled into the gap near the Rzhev salient, a place the Soviet soldiers were already calling the meat grinder. Mac and Billy were ordered to follow the squadron to a forward operating base. They weren't supposed to see combat, but in Russia, the rear was a relative term. The move was a chaotic symphony of desperation. While the Americans expected a fleet of transport trucks, they watched as the Soviets loaded spare parts, ammunition, and even drums of fuel onto horse-drawn sleds and ancient Gaz AA trucks that looked like they belonged in a museum.
"They're moving a modern fighter wing with horses, Mac,"
Billy whispered, watching a sturdy pony pull a crate containing a spare Allison engine through the slush. "It's like the 19th century is towing the 20th. "It works, Billy," Mac replied, watching the Soviet mechanics. "A horse doesn't need a carburetor heater, and a horse doesn't get stuck in mud that swallows a Jeep." They took off at dawn. Mac and Billy were crammed into a C-47 alongside 3 Soviet mechanics and a crate of 37mm shells. Below them, the P-39s, now painted with bold red stars on the fuselage, formed a protective screen around a group of the old wooden I-16s. It was a surreal sight. The sleek, tricycle-geared American Cobras flying alongside the stubby, open-cockpit donkeys. It was like watching thoroughbred horses escorting mountain goats. Chapter 8. The Ambush. Halfway to the forward base, the radio in the C-47 crackled with a frantic burst of Russian. Mac didn't need a translator to recognize the tone. It was the sound of a man seeing death. "Schmitz!" someone yelled over the frequency. From the glare of the morning sun, 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109Fs dived. They were the apex predators of the Luftwaffe, fuel-injected, expertly piloted, and fast. They ignored the Cobras at first, diving straight for the slow, lumbering I-16s and the transport plane. "They're coming for us!" Billy shouted, grabbing the edge of a packing crate. Mac watched through the small porthole. He expected the P-39s to break into a standard American thatch weave or a high-altitude dive. Instead, he saw Sokolov do something insane. Sokolov didn't climb to meet the Germans. He banked his P-39 hard, pulling so many Gs that Mac could almost hear the airframe groan from a mile away. He stayed low, dangerously low, skimming the tops of the trees. "What is he doing?" Billy screamed. "He's giving up the altitude advantage. He's a sitting duck!" But Sokolov knew his machine better than the Americans did. The P-39's Allison engine lacked a high-altitude turbocharger. It was a dog above 15,000 feet. But down here, in the thick air of the Russian winter, it was a beast. By staying low, Sokolov forced the Germans to dive into the ground clutter, making it harder for them to track him. One Messerschmitt overshot its dive, pulling up right in front of Sokolov's nose. Thump, thump, thump. The 37mm cannon in the P-39's nose fired. It wasn't the rapid chatter of machine guns. It was a rhythmic, heavy pounding. Mac saw the tracers, massive, glowing orbs of light. One shell struck the wing root of the Messerschmitt. In an instant, the German plane didn't just catch fire, it disintegrated. The heavy explosive shell tore the wing clean off the fuselage. The German pilot didn't even have time to scream before his plane became a tumbling ball of scrap metal. "My God," Mac breathed. "The power of that gun." Chapter 9. The Wooden Shield. But the battle wasn't over. 2 more Germans were on the tail of an I-16. The wooden plane was smoking, its fabric skin shredded by 20mm cannon fire. The American pilots back home would have called the I-16 a death trap. But as Mac watched, the Soviet pilot in the donkey did something that left him speechless. He didn't try to outrun the Germans. He pulled the nose up until the plane nearly stood still in the air, a maneuver that would have stalled any other aircraft. The I-16, being so light and having such a short wingspan, essentially flipped in place. The German pilot, expecting a standard turn, zoomed past. The donkey pilot leveled out and poured rifle-caliber fire into the German's tail. It didn't destroy the Messerschmitt, but it forced the German to break away. "They're fighting like dogs in a backyard," Billy said, his voice hushed with awe. "No formation, no tactics, just raw, bloody instinct." The remaining Germans, seeing that their easy prey had teeth, and that the new American planes could blow them out of the sky with a single hit, pulled up and vanished into the clouds. Chapter 10. The Mud and the Blood. When they finally landed at the forward base, a literal field of frozen mud, the atmosphere was electric. The Soviet pilots were shouting, hugging each other, and pointing at the noses of the P-39s. Sokolov climbed out of his cockpit. He was bleeding from a small cut on his forehead where he'd hit the gun sight during a hard maneuver. He walked straight to Mac. "The gun," Sokolov said, grinning. "The gun is the voice of God, Captain." But as the adrenaline faded, the reality of the forward base set in. There were no barracks. The pilots lived in zemlyankas, holes dug into the earth and covered with logs and dirt. There was no running water. The mess hall was a steaming pot of kasha, buckwheat, with chunks of salty lard. Mac and Billy were assigned a corner of a dugout. The walls dripped with condensation, and the smell of damp earth and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. "We sent them these planes," Mac said, sitting on a crate of ammunition. "We sent them the best technology we have, and they're flying them from a hole in the ground, eating fat and grain." "And they're winning," Billy added, looking at his shaking hands. "Mac, back in Buffalo, we argued for 3 weeks about the leather quality on the pilot's seat. These guys don't care about leather. They'd fly sitting on a barbed wire fence if it meant they could get that 37mm cannon into the air. That night, the sound of German artillery got louder. The meat grinder was only 10 miles away. Mac realized then that his job wasn't just to teach them how to fly. It was to learn how they survived. Chapter 11. The Critical Failure. 2 days later, the Cobra showed its dark side again. The temperature plummeted to minus 35 degrees Celsius. The American-made rubber seals on the P-39's hydraulic lines began to fail. They weren't designed for the Siberian air that was now sweeping across the Russian plains. "Captain, come quick!" It was Boris, the giant mechanic. He was pointing at a P-39 that was bleeding. Red hydraulic fluid was pooling in the snow beneath the fuselage. "The landing gear," Mac groaned, inspecting the leak. "The seals are cracking. If they try to land, the nose wheel will collapse." He looked around the airfield. 3 other Cobras were showing the same symptoms. The Americans' advanced technology was literally shattering in the cold. "We don't have replacement seals, Mac," Billy said, panic rising in his voice. "The supply train won't be here for a week. If the Germans attack now, these planes are grounded." Volkov walked up, his face grim. He looked at the leaking fluid, then at the horizon. "The Germans will be here at dawn. Their scouts were seen in the woods." "Major, we can't fly these," Mac insisted. "If the gear fails on landing, the pilot dies. The engine is right behind him. If the nose digs in, the engine will crush the pilot like a grape." Volkov looked at his pilots, who were huddled around a small fire trying to stay warm. Then he looked at Mac. "In Russia," Volkov said quietly, "we have a saying. If you are afraid of wolves, do not go into the forest. We will fly." "How?" Billy asked. "You can't fix those seals with hope." Volkov turned to Boris and shouted an order in Russian. Boris nodded and ran toward the supply hut. He emerged carrying a bundle of thick gray felt, the same material used to make Valenki, traditional Russian winter boots, and a bucket of thick, black industrial grease. "What are they doing?" Mac asked, watching as the mechanics began to strip the landing gear struts. "They're going to Russianize your plane, Captain," Volkov replied. Mac watched in a state of suspended disbelief as Boris and the other mechanics began their work. They didn't have a pressurized clean room or precision calipers. They had knives, needles, and the thick, coarse felt of Russian winter boots. They cut the felt into strips, soaking them in a mixture of thick aircraft grease and a secret ingredient Mac later identified as rendered animal fat. They wrapped these makeshift gaskets around the hydraulic pistons and bound them tightly with copper wire scavenged from a downed radio set. "Billy, they're literally bandaging the landing gear," Mac muttered, shaking his head. "It'll never hold," Billy whispered back. "The pressure in those lines is over 1,000 pounds per square inch. That felt will shred, the fluid will spray, and the whole thing will go up like a Roman candle." But as the first, repaired Cobra taxied out, the gear held. The grease-soaked felt contracted in the cold, creating a seal that was ugly, primitive, and, to Mac's engineering soul, offensive. Yet, it worked. The Valenki fix kept the pressure in. "You see, Captain," Volkov said, standing in the freezing wind, "American science is a beautiful woman. She is wonderful when the sun shines. But the Russian engineering is an old grandmother. She is ugly, but she knows how to survive the winter." Chapter 13. The Shadow in the Woods. The piece of the repair work was shattered, not by a plane, but by a sound that made every Russian pilot reach for his sidearm, the rhythmic, mechanical clack, clack, clack of a tank tread. The forward base wasn't just near the front. The front had moved to them. "Panzers!" a lookout screamed from a wooden tower. Out of the tree line, less than a mile away, 3 German Panzer III tanks emerged, their long barrels slewing toward the parked aircraft. Behind them, Infantry in gray coats began to fan out, their MP-40 submachine guns ready. The airfield was in chaos. Most of the pilots were still on the ground. The P-39s were fueled, but they were sitting ducks. "We have to get them up!" Mac shouted. "If those tanks reach the line, they'll crush the planes like tin cans." "No time to taxi," Volkov roared. "Sokolov, go!" Sokolov didn't wait for a signal. He sprinted to his Cobra, the one with the felt-wrapped landing gear. There was no time for a pre-flight check. He slammed the car-style door shut, and the Allison engine screamed to life, spitting blue flame from its exhaust stacks. Chapter 14. The Ground War. The German tanks opened fire. An 50mm shell struck the edge of the hangar, showering Mac and Billy with splinters and frozen mud. "Get down!" Mac tackled Billy into a shallow trench. From the trench, Mac watched a feat of airmanship that defied everything written in the Bell aircraft flight manual. Sokolov didn't head for the runway. He turned his P-39 directly toward the advancing German tanks, accelerating across the uneven, pothole-ridden field. The tricycle gear bounced violently. Mac braced for the nose wheel to snap, but the Russian boot seals held. Just as the lead tank leveled its gun at the plane, Sokolov pulled back on the stick. The Cobra leaped into the air, clearing the tank by less than 10 feet. But Sokolov didn't climb. He stayed at an altitude of maybe 20 feet. He circled back in a tight, snapping turn. "He's going to use the cannon," Mac realized, his heart hammering against his ribs. "He's going to dogfight a tank!" The 37mm M4 cannon was designed to knock bombers out of the sky. Against the thin top armor of a Panzer III, it was a different story. Thump, thump, thump. The heavy shell slammed into the rear engine deck of the lead tank. Even from the trench, Mac could hear the impact, a sound like a giant sledgehammer hitting an anvil. The tank's engine exploded, sending a plume of oily black smoke into the white sky. The other two tanks turned their turret machine guns upward, tracers stitching the air around the P-39. Sokolov didn't flinch. He dived again, his wing-mounted machine guns raking the German infantry, forcing them to dive for cover in the snow. Chapter 15. The Price of Survival. While Sokolov provided cover, the rest of the squadron scrambled. 2 more P-39s and 3 donkeys rose into the air, a motley collection of wood and metal rising from the mud. The battle was short and brutal. Without infantry support and under fire from the air, the remaining German tanks began to retreat into the woods. But the victory wasn't free. One of the I-16s, piloted by a quiet boy named Fedor, who had shared his bread with Billy the night before, took a direct hit from a tank's anti-aircraft machine gun. The wooden wing didn't just break, it shattered. The plane spun into the ground and disappeared in a muffled whoomp of flame. When the remaining planes landed, the mood wasn't triumphant. It was grim. Mac climbed out of the trench, his American uniform covered in Russian mud. He walked over to Sokolov's plane. The Valenki seals on the landing gear were charred and smoking, but they had held. The fuselage was peppered with small arms fire. Sokolov climbed out, his hands shaking with spent adrenaline. He looked at Mac and pointed to the empty 37mm shell casings littering the cockpit floor. "You see, Mac," Sokolov said, using Mac's name for the first time. "Your plane is a good soldier. It likes to fight on the ground as much as the sky." "That was suicide, Andre," Mac said, his voice cracking. "You aren't supposed to use a fighter like a dive bomber at 20 feet. Sokolov wiped grease from his face. "In the West, you fly for superiority. Here, we fly because if we stop, our mothers and sisters behind that tree line die. Do you understand? There is no proper way to use a gun when the enemy is in your house." Chapter 16. The Night of the Vodka. That evening, in the damp, dark Zemlyanka, the hierarchy between instructors and students finally collapsed. Volkov produced a bottle of Samagon, homemade moonshine that smelled like industrial solvent. He poured it into rusted tin cups. "To Fedor," Volkov said simply. They drank. The liquid felt like molten lead sliding down Mac's throat. He coughed, his eyes watering, while the Russians drank it like water. Mac, Billy said, leaning in. I looked at the I-16 Fedor was flying. The instrument panel was held in with medical tape. The altimeter didn't even work. Billy looked at the Russian pilots sitting around the small wood stove. We've been complaining about the radio quality and the heater vents in the P-39. These guys are flying wooden crates with no radios, using boot scraps to fix our high-tech hydraulics. And they just saved our lives. Mac looked at Major Volkov. Major, I want to apologize. When we got here, we thought we were the ones who knew about war. We thought we were the teachers. Volkov set his cup down. The scar on his cheek looked silver in the dim light. You brought us a good tool, Captain. The Cobra is strong. But a tool is only as good as the hand that holds it. Tomorrow, you will show us how to adjust the weight in the tail. We lost the man today because his plane was too heavy in the turn. We fixed that, yes? Yes, Mac said. We fix it. The day after the tank attack, the airfield was a hive of frantic, cold-stiffened activity. Mac realized that the flat spin issue wasn't just a pilot error. It was a physics problem, exacerbated by the way the Soviets were forced to fight. The P-39 was tail-heavy, and when its ammunition was spent, the center of gravity shifted even further back, making the plane a spinning top of death. Billy, get the scales and the lead weights, Mac ordered. We're stripping the unnecessary weight from the rear and moving the battery forward. They spent 14 hours straight in the sub-zero wind. Mac watched as the Soviet mechanics removed the heavy American radios.
Wait, you need those for coordination, Billy protested.
Radio is heavy, Boris grunted, tossing a high-end Bell radio unit into the snow as if it were a bag of rocks. And Germans jam the frequency anyway. We fly by hand signals. We fly by looking at the leader's wings. Give us more bullets, not more talking. Mac was horrified, but intrigued. By removing the bulky radio equipment and some of the rear armor plating, which the Russians claimed was useless against 20mm cannons anyway, they shifted the balance. They were tuning a precision instrument into a raw, jagged blade. Chapter 18. The Secret in the Cockpit. While working on Sokolov's P-39, Mac found something tucked under the pilot's seat. It wasn't a manual or a lucky charm. It was a heavy, jagged piece of sharpened steel, a crude knife, and a small, leather-bound book of poetry. He carries a knife for the Germans if he's shot down, Volkov said, appearing behind Mac. And the poetry? Well, a man needs to remember why he is a man when he spends all day being a machine. Mac looked at the poetry, then at the sleek, deadly aircraft. He realized the Americans built planes for missions, but the Russians lived in these planes. To them, the P-39 wasn't a weapon system, it was an extension of their own desperate will to exist. Chapter 19. The Black Horizon. The sound came before the sight, a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in the very marrow of Mac's bones. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a few fighters. It was a swarm. Luftwaffe, Volkov whispered, his eyes narrowing. Heinkels, and a lot of them. A massive formation of Heinkel HE-111 bombers was approaching, escorted by a wall of Messerschmitts. They were heading for the rail junction 5 miles behind the airfield, the lifeline for the entire sector. Sokolov's engine is still open. We're halfway through the balance adjustment, Billy yelled over the rising roar. Close it up. Forget the torque settings. Just bolt it down, Mac screamed. But as the Soviet pilots scrambled, Mac realized they were short-handed. 2 pilots were down with frostbite, and Fedor was dead. There were 3 functional Airacobras sitting on the line, but only 2 pilots ready to fly them. Mac looked at the silver P-39, the one he had spent the last 6 hours rewiring. He looked at Billy. Mac, don't even think about it, Billy said, reading his mind. You're a tech rep. You're a civilian contractor. You're not allowed to fly combat missions. If those bombers hit the junction, no one is going home, Billy. Not us, not the Russians, Mac said. He grabbed a discarded flight helmet. And besides, I need to see if our fix actually works. Chapter 20. Into the Blue. Mac climbed into the cockpit. It felt familiar, yet alien. The smell was a mix of American leather and Russian grease. He hit the starter. The Allison engine, his engine, vibrated with a clean, powerful hum. He taxied out alongside Sokolov and Volkov. Sokolov looked over from his cockpit, his eyes wide with shock. He saw the Texan in the cockpit of the third Cobra. Sokolov didn't salute. He just slammed his fist against his chest and pointed toward the sky. The takeoff was a blur. Mac pushed the throttle to the wall. The P-39 leaped off the muddy earth. For the first time, the plane felt right. It didn't feel tail-heavy. It felt like a part of his own body. They climbed to meet the swarm. The sky above Russia was a chaotic canvas of gray and black. Thousands of feet below, the white landscape was dotted with the fires of burning villages. Mac saw the bomber formation, a rigid, disciplined V-shape. "Break!" Volkov's voice crackled in Mac's headset. The Russians had left Mac's radio in so they could guide him. Suddenly, the world turned upside down. Tracers zipped past Mac's canopy like glowing red needles. A Bf-109 was on his tail. Mac's training kicked in. He didn't try to outclimb the German. He remembered what Sokolov had done. He dived. He forced the P-39 into the thick, freezing air near the ground. The plane screamed, the airspeed indicator needle dancing near the red line. He pulled a hard, high-G turn. In the old configuration, the plane would have entered a flat spin and killed him. But with the moved battery and the removed radio, the nose stayed down. The American girl bit into the air and held. The German pilot, surprised by the maneuverability of the clumsy P-39, overshot. Mac leveled out. The Messerschmitt was right in his crosshairs. He felt the cold steel of the trigger under his gloved finger. Thump, thump, thump. The 37mm cannon fired. The recoil shook the entire airframe, slowing the plane down with every shot. It felt like a giant was kicking the fuselage. The first shell missed. The second shell clipped the German's tail. The third shell, the voice of God, struck the cockpit of the Messerschmitt. The German plane didn't fall, it simply ceased to be a plane. It became a spray of glittering confetti in the winter sun. Chapter 21. The Terror of the Sky. Mac didn't have time to celebrate. He was surrounded. He saw Sokolov flying like a madman, weaving in and out of the bomber formation, using his cannon to tear the wings off the Heinkels. It wasn't a tactical dogfight. It was a brawl. Mac saw a Heinkel bomber's rear gunner aiming at him. He felt the thwack-thwack of bullets hitting his wing. He ignored it. He focused on the bomber's engine. He fired again. The 37mm shell punched through the engine cowling, and a geyser of flame erupted. But then, his engine coughed. "No, no, no," Mac whispered. The coolant temperature gauge was pegged in the red. A stray bullet from the bomber had nicked the radiator, the vulnerable belly of the Cobra that Sokolov had warned him about. The cabin began to fill with the sweet, choking smell of glycol. The cockpit was a death trap. White smoke from the vaporizing glycol billowed from the floorboards, stinging Mac's eyes and clogging his throat. The Allison engine, deprived of its lifeblood, began to let out a rhythmic, agonizing metal-on-metal scream. "Mac, get out of there! Bail out!" Billy's voice was a ghost in his headset, fading as the electrical system began to melt. Mac looked down. Beneath him wasn't a friendly landing field. It was a jagged sea of black pines and deep, treacherous snow. If he jumped, the wind would carry him into the wilderness, where the temperature would kill him before the German scouts did. "Not today," Mac wheezed, sliding the car door window open to let out the smoke. The sub-zero air rushed in, freezing the sweat on his face instantly, but it cleared his vision. He shut down the engine to prevent a fire. The sudden silence was terrifying. The P-39 was now a 7,000-pound glider. He traded altitude for airspeed, banking the heavy machine toward the smudge of smoke on the horizon that marked the Ivanovo airfield. Chapter 23. The Crash of the Titan. As the airfield came into view, Mac realized he was too low. The trees were reaching for his belly. He saw the Valenki felt-wrapped landing gear lever. He slammed it down. He heard the hydraulic pump groan, a desperate, dying sound, and felt the 3 wheels lock into place. The Soviet mechanics had saved him. The ugly grandmother engineering held. The P-39 clipped the tops of the last row of pines with a sickening crunch. The plane pancaked onto the icy runway, bouncing violently. The nose wheel, the weak point of the entire design, hit a frozen rut. Mac braced for the engine behind him to break its mounts and crush his spine. Instead, the plane skidded, spinning 180 degrees in a cloud of snow and sparks, and came to a rest a few feet from the fuel depot. Silence returned to the Russian steppe. Chapter 24. Blood and Vodka. Mac was pulled from the cockpit by Boris and Volkov. They didn't use a stretcher. They hauled him out by his armpits and dumped him in the snow. Mac coughed, spitting out the taste of glycol. He looked up. The sky was clear of Germans. Sokolov's plane was already on the ground, its nose blackened by cannon soot. "You fly like a Russian," Volkov said, his face a mask of grime and exhaustion. He looked at the wreckage of Mac's plane. "But you land like an American. Too much drama." Sokolov walked over, his flight suit torn. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small book of poetry Mac had seen earlier. He handed it to Mac. "In Buffalo, you make the steel," Sokolov said in a low voice. "But here, we give the steel a reason to fly. You keep this, to remember." Mac took the book. "We lost 3 planes, Nikolai. Was the junction saved?" Volkov nodded toward the horizon. The rail lines were intact. The supply train, carrying the food and ammunition for the Rzhev front, was already steaming through. "Because of your sniper plane, Captain. And because of the mad Texan who didn't know how to stay in a hole." Chapter 25. The Departure. 2 weeks later, a C-47 arrived to take Mac and Billy back to the States. Their evaluation mission was over. They had hundreds of pages of technical notes: how to reinforce the tail, how to cold-proof the seals, and how to adjust the ammunition feed for the 37mm. As they walked toward the transport, the entire 22nd Regiment stood on the tarmac. There were no brass bands, no medals, and no polished parades. There were just men and women in grease-stained coats, standing beside their wooden donkeys and their iron Cobras. Billy looked at the row of P-39s. They didn't look like the pristine machines that had left the Buffalo factory. They were patched with felt, painted with crude slogans like, "For the Motherland," and dented by combat. "They're going to keep using them, aren't they?" Billy asked. "They're going to use them until the wings fall off," Mac replied. "And then they'll probably find a way to make the wings out of pine and fly them some more." As the C-47 lifted off, Mac looked down at the tiny figures on the ground. He saw Sokolov standing on the wing of his Cobra, waving a fur hat. Chapter 26. The Legacy. Years later, back in the heat of Texas, Mac would often sit on his porch and look at the book of Russian poetry. He couldn't read the words, but he could still smell the engine oil and the damp earth of the Zemlyankas. The P-39 Airacobra was never a favorite of American pilots. They called it a misfit, a plane with too many quirks and a dangerous engine placement. But to the Soviet pilots, it was the Cobra. They used it to produce some of the highest-scoring aces in history, like Alexander Pokrishkin, who refused to give up his P-39 even when offered newer, better American planes. Mack knew why. It wasn't because the plane was perfect. It was because, in the frozen mud of Ivanovo, two different worlds had met. One brought the iron, and the other brought the silk and the soul to make it fly. The Americans had come to teach, but they were the ones who had learned what it meant to fight when everything, even the laws of physics, was against you. The end.